The Murder Shelf Book Club contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Listener discretion is advised.
Law enforcement served up the perfect patsies to the mob screaming for blood and justice. The West Memphis police, followed by Prosecutor Brent Davis and Crittenden County Deputy Prosecutor John Fogelman, turned the atrocity into a stage-managed drama that would consume not just the 3 victims and their families, but ultimately 6 families who would lose their sons in its clouded wake. Dan Stidham, A Harvest of Innocence, the Untold Story of the West Memphis 3 Murder Case. Welcome to the Murder Shelf Book Club. I am your host, Jill. After a number of requests for a book on this case, here it is. This is episode 102, Righteous Malice, part 1 of A Harvest of Innocence, the Untold Story of the West Memphis 3 Murder Case by Dan Stidham and Tom McCarthy. If you aren't aware of the West Memphis 3, you have been blessed, because this is a disturbing case that weighs heavily for reasons that will become quickly apparent. But first, happy fall, murder bookies. This is my favorite time of year, and I want to welcome Roxanne, Michelle, Suzanne, and Andrea to the Murder Shelf Book Club Patreon group. Thank you for your help in choosing this book, for your input and insight. I see you as you hear me. New developments. Now you can leave comments on Spotify podcast. And I have had 2, all negative, complaining about the early sound in the first episodes. And they're totally correct. Podcasting is not easy, and the learning curve is really steep. And I apologize for the audio being imperfect in those early days. Between learning how to do this, the pandemic hitting, quarantining, remote recording, well, it took its toll. But we have come a long way together. Production value is so much better now. So thank you for being with me on our journey together, looking into these stories, the updates, analysis on the best true crime books out there. It is a joy to be doing this, and I cannot do it without you. You know, I'd actually appreciate knowing what you think of the episodes with really good audio, too. So think about that one. So, the West Memphis 3. Now, this is probably the most complicated case I have brought to you. I met author Dan Stidham at CrimeCon 2024 in Nashville, and I could have listened to him all day discuss his role as Jessie Misskelley's devoted defense attorney. Much I had never heard before, so I encourage all of you to read his book. Controversial still, some maintain their belief in the guilt of Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley, who were convicted of the heinous murders of 3 little boys 3 decades ago. These sweet little boys were Christopher Byers, Stevie Branch, and Michael Moore, 8-year-old bike-riding Cub Scouts killed on May 5th, 1993. I follow the evidence as it takes you to where you are. Dan has stuck by his client through this entire legal fandangle, never giving up on the search for justice. A Harvest of Innocence is also Dan's personal story, recounting the trials, tribulations, disappointments, shocks, and ultimately arriving at a jaded justice. He's an eyewitness, he is a participant, because he lived through these events too. Silent for 30 years, his behind-the-scenes observations, conversations, and revelations leave one experiencing all the emotions, being exasperated, aghast, feeling guilty, amazed, relieved. Stidham looks back at himself as a 30-year-old lawyer, this younger, inexperienced self so idealistically plunging into his law career and sympathizes with the learning curve that toppled over on top of him during the Misskelley trial and beyond. I know that you've come to expect a full account of these cases we explore, so I have read a number of other books on the case. George Jarrett's Witches in West Memphis and Devil's Knot by Mara Leverett. And I have watched a great number of documentaries to gain a wider perspective on this multi-layered judicial boondoggle. All of my sources, show notes, photographs, and more are on my blog at www.murdershelfbookclub.com. Check it out and be sure to read Dan's book. So as a child, Dan Stidham knew he wanted to be a lawyer. His mom tells stories of him addressing imaginary juries standing on a tree stump in the backyard as a kid. Now, this drive may stem from the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis in 1968, which triggered backlash and chaos, followed by the assassination of Robert Kennedy in Los Angeles right after he'd won the California primary in his pursuit of the presidency. Dan suggests witnessing these events as a child, quote, instilled in me a subliminal awareness of injustice, end quote. Growing up in Paragould, Arkansas, Dan loved to hunt and fish in the woods, was a quarterback for his Greene County Tech junior varsity Eagles football team, and he was an Eagle Scout. His parents taught him that he could do anything if he put his mind to it. Overeager to get going on this lawyer thing, he dropped out of high school, which was an interesting choice, and he began going to the University of Arkansas, Jonesboro. 4 years later, he began law school at the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville. Establishing himself as an attorney took time and a lot of effort. Marrying Kim, they would have 3 children, Daniel, Christopher, and Catherine. He made painful choices, trying to find work-life balance, juggling time at the office versus that with the family. And this would get increasingly more difficult after Jessie Misskelley Jr. entered Dan's orbit. Now, we are just beginning our Harvest of Innocence book club, so I have something very tasty to share with you. A delicacy in Arkansas, possum pie. Now, this is by far the most complicated recipe I've brought to you, but each of the 4 steps is fairly straightforward. So first, you make the pecan shortbread crust, which is no harder than making a graham cracker pie crust. Pretty easy. Next, you make the chocolate pudding layer with cocoa, not the box kind. Then comes the cream cheese layer, which I assure you is simply scrumptious. Finally is the whipped cream layer, topped by chocolate shavings and chopped pecans. The trick here is letting each of the layers cool completely. The chocolate layer needs 4 hours in the fridge, so I suggest making possum pie the day prior to your book club and then assembling it that morning. It requires no baking, and it is simply worth it. So enjoy your Arkansas possum pie, courtesy of Amy from thehouseofnasheats.com. Now, I decided to forego my usual bottle of wine, choosing a very good bourbon instead. Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey's Woodford Reserve. I decided that we needed something stronger for the West Memphis 3 case, murder bookies. Now, an important tip. When you are tasting whiskey or bourbon, you take the first sip. Wait about 25 seconds, and then sip again. This second sip is the real taste of the bourbon or whiskey, not the first when your taste buds are twitching. So Woodford Reserve is a robust bronze color, a solid, bold choice, and you'll sense a hint of dried fruit, nuts, even bananas, which is chased by an infusion of vanilla and pepper, smooth and oaky, among other floral notes. Now, I bought my bottle locally, but you can buy it online at www.reservebar.com for $24. Now, you better plan to Uber home tonight, okay? So sip and savor, murder bookies. So Dan begins reflecting that the killer is likely alive and going about his business these last 30 years. This man is unconcerned about the shattered lives he left in his wake, perhaps experiencing a tinge of concern that he could still be arrested. Dan believes this man is a psychopath who experiences no remorse, no empathy, and certainly no guilt. But he was not alone in doing damage in West Memphis. Quote, "The prosecution, the police, and the judge were malevolent steamrollers, and I was a young lawyer unable to see clearly back then. I can now, though. While the Alford plea freed the young men, they are stained for life." End quote. The West Memphis Three would spend 18 years and 78 days incarcerated for a crime that they did not commit. Justice came, but the downside of the Alford plea is they will never be compensated for the decades that were stolen from them. It also means the real killer may never be prosecuted because the case is solved as far as Arkansas is concerned. They just want this to go away. Well, not until Dan Stidham tells his story, a true accounting of what happened while the judge, the prosecutors, and police have never been held accountable for creating this debacle in the first place.
They are still
Praised by some for putting the devil in jail, when the truth is they put innocent teenagers in jail without the slightest concern that a vicious killer was still on the loose. Those boys were, quote, locked away with a casual indifference to the facts. They were young men from the wrong side of the tracks, put in prison by a group of misguided men who wanted nothing more than to burnish their reputations and satisfy a public frenzy that demanded retribution. End quote. Dan writes that the consequences of taking Jessie Misskelley on as a client is a heavy load to bear. Anxiety, sleepless nights, the images of gruesome murders flashing before his eyes, the frustration, endless hours of toiling, trying to do the best for Jessie, while being targeted for defending the devil worshippers, while Jessie Misskelley received threats on his life, which continue through this day. It is important that you see where Dan is coming from and how his story unfolds. Dripping wet after a shower, Dan answered his phone. It was Judge David Goodson, seeking someone to represent Jessie Misskelley, arrested as one of those who had been involved in the killing of the 3 8-year-old boys in West Memphis. Uncertain whether or not he should, Dan reached out to his legal partner, Greg Crow, who didn't pick up. Well, these are the days of landlines and no cell phones. After consulting his wife, Kim, who understood Dan's deep devotion to the law, justice, and serving, she agreed. Optimistic and inspired, Dan called the judge back telling him he'd take the case. And the life of the Stidhams changed dramatically in that moment, without even the slightest stir in the air. Dan compares himself to Sisyphus, condemned by the gods to forevermore push the heavy rock up a hill. Every aspect of Dan's life would be filtered evermore through the lens of the West Memphis 3 case. His marriage broke up, his children suffered in his absence, his emotional well-being was tested, and none of this can be compared to the suffering of Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley. On attending his first hearing, the 3 boys had gone missing and were found the next day in a drainage ditch, and all Dan could think is that they were the same age as his oldest son, all second graders. Horrifying. Every parent hugs their child closer on learning such news as this. And triple homicides are rare, and those involving children are even rarer. Soon, the media began reporting sexual assault and mutilation as shivers and outrage reverberated out like a primal scream. A bit about West Memphis, Arkansas. On coming into the area on Interstate Highway 40 and 55 in 1993, you would notice some new signs erected, welcoming folks to the state. Arkansas, the home of President Bill Clinton. Now, these important highways merge in West Memphis and then quickly divide. Quote, travelers heading for St. Louis and Chicago merge right. Those heading to Little Rock, Dallas, or Oklahoma City merge left, end quote. What this means is the bodies of these little boys were found in a place called Robin Hood Hills, which was located right behind the service road, which led immediately to the Blue Beacon truck wash and truck stop parking lot, providing the killer with easy access and a quick getaway. These 3 boys were found nude. Each was hog-tied, wrist to ankle on each side, with his own sneaker shoelaces. One boy had trauma to his face, neck, and ears. Another's penis and scrotum had been removed. The skin had been ripped from the skull of another. The evidence. A hair was recovered from the tree stump nearby, and another was found intertwined with the ligature knot on Michael Moore. A partial handprint and 1 footprint in the mud were noted. The clothing of the victims, largely inside out, was recovered, having been submerged in the water held down with a stick. Unfortunately, once the first body was located, the area was trampled by additional arriving police, who were frankly overwhelmed with a triple homicide. An offer of assistance was given by the Arkansas State Police, but refused. All right, we covered this in my episodes on John Benet Ramsey, when the Boulder PD in Colorado rejected offer from the state police and FBI. Like, why wouldn't you accept help when it is offered? How many agencies are dealing with the triple homicide of 3 children? Few, thank God. Well, at the time the community and police were dispatched searching for the boys, West Memphis police officer Regina Meeks was sent to the Bojangles restaurant. A mentally disoriented black man had come in and headed into the ladies' room. He was bleeding, brushed up against the wall of the room, and saturated a roll of toilet paper with blood. He left, leaving behind a pair of bloody sunglasses. Officer Meeks spoke to the restaurant manager from the drive-through window, quote, apparently so underwhelmed she couldn't bother to even get out and at least check the bathroom, end quote. Well, I appreciate Dan's snark. The restaurant manager had preserved the bloody toilet paper and the glasses, but he was instructed to throw them away and sure, he could clean up the restroom. Only after the bodies were discovered the next day did West Memphis Police Detective Brian Ridge return to the restaurant, and he took blood scrapings from the now cleaned up walls in the bathroom. The toilet paper and glasses had been thrown out. And later, Detective Ridge admitted to losing these blood scrapings, which never made it to the crime lab. We will never know if, air quotes, Mr. Bojangles was related to this case or this was just some weird coincidence. Interestingly, Dan Stidham was never notified of any of this loss of evidence. He had to learn this from a Memphis reporter. In West Memphis, the shock and horror of the people gave way to righteous anger, as the vast majority of people in the Mid-South are deeply religious and take the Bible literally. Who would do this? Who? Only the very worst of the worst. Satanists, cultists. There was no other explanation. Overnight, whispers of Satan worshippers in the area erupted. Now, today, we know this era of the Satanic Panic is long discredited. But in 1993, people did not know, and they believed. Back in 1980, so this is before the murders, a now discredited book, Michelle Remembers, was written by a Canadian psychiatrist, Lawrence Padzer, and his patient wife, which is very questionable, Michelle Smith, about her memories of ritualistic abuse as a child. Padzer had used a recovered memory therapy, which has also been long debunked. Padzer and Smith would make approximately $350,000 on the book tour, with Smith appearing on the oh-so-popular Oprah Winfrey Show. Michelle Remembers, all of this was unconfirmed, but taken very seriously. Other books would come out, international symposiums held on satanic-induced child abuse. the Los Angeles McMartin preschool child abuse case hit the news, where 360 children were suspected of having been abused. Unfortunately, adults investigating used inappropriate interview techniques that allowed the children to speculate about what may have happened to them during preschool. These are little kids, and they were coerced into making some accusations, which included flying in hot air balloons and being taken down in tunnels beneath the school. The trials ultimately resulted in hung juries and acquittals after 7 years of legal hijinks, and concluded in 1990, just 3 years prior to the murders in West Memphis. New York City police had a satanic crimes unit to investigate all of the allegations and abuse that were heaped upon the citizens of the Big Apple. So people were freaked out about satanic cults, which were seeking out kids, and a lot of stuff got made up. So I hope you have a general sense of the genuine pervasive fear and the not so rooted in fact beliefs that people held at the time, and not just in Arkansas. So the investigation begins with the parents and the community up in arms, demanding that the West Memphis Police Department find out who had done this terrible thing, with pressure on the police mounting as nothing materialized. Making the national news, media satellite trucks were everywhere, creating a circus-like atmosphere. Driven by fear for their eternal souls, under siege by evil, rationality evaporated and mass hysteria took root, and scapegoats had to be found to appease the masses. 18-year-old Damien Echols, a loner and nonconformist, and Wiccan, because that religion was so understood in the 1990s, and his best friend, 16-year-old Jason Baldwin, they had to be in on it. And then Jessie Misskelley confessed, pouring gas on the inferno. Jessie was 17 years old and intellectually challenged. The police brought him in for questioning without his parents' approval or their signatures on a Miranda warning required by law, which Jessie really didn't understand. And they kept hammering the teenager over and over for half a day, over 12 hours. We will discuss Jessie's confession in detail, I promise. But suffice to say, Jessie wanted this over. He didn't like being interrogated by the police. Who does? And he wanted to go home. He would tell them what they wanted to hear. He would say the boys were killed at noon and that they had skipped school that day. The police then coaxed, nudged, and suggested Jessie towards the actual time, closer to dark. It had been 6, 7 p.m.? Well, yes. Nodding, the police affirmed that time and moved on to the next bit of incorrect information that he had revealed. With a recording of this confession, the police went to a judge to get the arrest warrant signed, and a judge denied it because this confession didn't match with the elements of the crime. So the police went back. They now maneuvered Jessie into saying more of what was needed, and this time the arrest warrants were signed. The West Memphis Three were arrested, with Jessie actually expecting to go home. Within hours of Dan taking on Jessie's case, reporters, news programs, CNN, ABC, CBS, NBC, 2020, Phil Donahue, Unsolved Mysteries, Jerry Springer, Nighttime, A Current Affair, and more all called Dan, with him rejecting all of them as the feeding frenzy drove the public. May 19, 1993. A person who would have a singular impact on the trials, Victoria Hutchison, entered the story. Police were familiar with Vicky, as she was called, after an allegation that she had stolen from her employer. She would tell the West Memphis police that she had attended a witches' meeting with Damien Echols and Jessie Misskelley right before the murders. Well, this was wonderful news, shoring up the police's fragile satanic ritual murder theory. Inconvenient fact: Jessie Misskelley and Damien Echols weren't friends and didn't hang out together, never going anywhere, let alone to an SBAT. Search warrants enacted, the police seized boxes from the trailers that Damien and Jason Baldwin lived in. Metallica and Slayer t-shirts, Stephen King books were all evidence of murder. Jason would ask why the officers didn't take any of his white t-shirts. Point on young Baldwin. And I think this is truly desperate. I mean, reading Stephen King is evidence of murder? Metallica t-shirts? West Memphis Police Inspector Gary Gitchell was asked by a reporter on a scale of 1 to 10 how strong was his case against the teens. And he beamed 11. Black t-shirts, Stephen King books, huh? Dan Stidham hadn't really considered what being one of the West Memphis Three's defense attorneys meant, having no clue of the hatred and revulsion he would face. He was focusing on figuring out how to get a plea deal that would keep Jessie off death row. But his immediate problem was Jessie's dad, Jessie Misskelley Sr., who was adamant that his son had not killed those little boys. Jessie Sr. had let Jessie go with the police only after they promised him, quote, a $35,000 reward that had been offered if little Jessie could provide information about the murders, end quote. After the arrest, every night, after having quite a bit of alcohol, Big Jessie spoke to the press, defending his son the only way he could. But Dan thought it was kind of odd given that little Jessie had confessed. But Big Jessie insisted Jessie Jr. wasn't in West Memphis when those boys were killed. His son was wrestling in Diez, Arkansas, 50 miles or 80 kilometers away. But Dan saw it was imperative that Big Jessie stop talking if Dan was going to negotiate a plea deal and save his son's life. Big Jessie was fighting the only way he could. Also challenging, putting together a defense from the inconsistent, befuddled discussions with Jessie. This was frustrating. Due to the confession, which Dan actually read parts of in the Memphis Commercial Appeal newspaper, because parts had been leaked, which had poisoned the jury pool, Dan believed that guilt was a foregone conclusion. The whole confession was actually faxed to him by Damien Echols' attorney. Quote, I was chilled. The gruesome details were far worse than I had imagined. Even so, several glaring inconsistencies leapt out at me as I read and reread the statements and subsequent statements made by Misskelley to clarify the first. Those inconsistencies pushed his confession into the realm of the impossible. Interrogators had also compressed a 12-hour interview into a 30-minute format, end quote. And he wondered who leaked the confession. Protected by the First Amendment, no reporter was required to reveal a source. Dan and his law partner, Greg Crow, met with Jessie at the Clay County Detention Center in Pigot on a miserably hot day. It is no easy thing to go into a prison, the eyes of the condemned radiating their darkness and malignance. Stomach rolling, hairs on his neck sticking up straight, Dan was brought to a concrete table to meet a kid, the size of a 10-year-old, a wrestling featherweight. This could not be the devil-worshipping murderer. No way. But it was. Greg and Dan began interviewing Jessie and about tore their hair out, which is ironically the same reaction that the West Memphis police had when they were interrogating him. Jessie had no conception of a timeline. His story had no cohesion. He watched the 3 little boys get brutally assaulted and killed. One had his genitals torn off, but he didn't actually recall what happened. Jessie even mixed up who had been castrated. How was that possible? Something was very wrong here. Jessie had insisted the boys were bound with a brown rope, which was incorrect. It had been their own shoelaces, and that was widely reported. And Jessie seemed to be the only one who didn't know this, which was just impossible. Answering with a series of yeahs and grunts, Dan got a sick feeling in his stomach. Why couldn't Jessie tell him what happened? And how can we get him ready to testify against Damien and Jason? How do we save him from the death penalty? As they wrapped up, Jessie finally made a solid statement. Quote, "I don't want to die in no electric chair." End quote. Well, Dan and Greg were confused. Then Jessie told him that the West Memphis police told him this and that he was going to die in the electric chair, his body shaking with fear. Well, what the heck? The electric chair was no longer used as a form of capital punishment, and certainly the police knew this and had deliberately decided to terrorize Jessie. Explaining that lethal injection was the current form of execution did not help because Jessie didn't understand what he was talking about. And their next meeting went on the same way, with Jessie just incapable of providing any consistent, cohesive narrative. This, combined with Big Jessie's nightly commentary, Dan was at a loss of how he was going to negotiate a plea deal. Giving it one final try, he again asked Big Jessie to stop talking to the media. But the father protested that his son had not done this and that he had been wrestling that night with Ricky Dees. Big Jessie did not understand why his boy had confessed. He handed a note to Dan that Jessie had written to his dad, and in it, 2 times Jessie Jr. insisted he had not killed those boys. Well, this was big, and this was why Big Jessie was so adamant and certain of Jessie's innocence. More confused, Dan thought, what the hell is going on here? Reflecting back can cast the dark past with a brighter light of clarity. In every tale, there are winners and there are losers, and the story is usually written by the winners. Well, in the West Memphis 3 case, Judge David Burnett was the big winner. Savvy guy, he knew his audience and inevitably made himself look good, ensuring, quote, every day that the halo he seemed to have hung over his head stayed in place, admired by all. In his imagination, he was the good judge who threw the book at the devil himself, end quote. Well, so much for a judge arbitrating the law unbiasedly, affirming that a fair trial is had by all. Well, the limelight can shine down on judges. We saw this in the 2023 Murdaugh trial with Judge Clifton Newman. Now that, in my opinion, was one terrific judge. Now the court clerk, oh my God, Becky Hill, she created a total mess, and we're probably going to see another Murdaugh trial because of her. Because, listen, the trials have to be done right. They really do. But I digress. Anyway, I totally agree with Dan's assessment of Judge David Burnett. He views himself as the selfless adjudicator who brought closure to the heartbroken parents, restored faith, trust, and security for the public, doing his Christian civic duty and smiting Mephistopheles himself. His overdeveloped, bloated ego continues to this day. He is not humble. He is not regretful. Now, the guilt that I would experience if I had stolen the lives of 3 teenagers, locked them up where they were subjected to the brutality of prison, beatings, assaults, health impacted, and Damien Echols was given the death penalty. And Innocent would have had his life snuffed out on this judge's watch. Remember on the Betsy Faria and the Louis Gumpenberger murders, episodes 40 to 44 on Bone Deep? I was very critical of that judge, who didn't even know the law. So at least Burnett seems to know the law, even if he applied it with great bias. So it is important to understand Dan's perspective on Judge Burnett in order to understand Dan's story. Quote, in a case that surely had no winners, this folksy, no-nonsense Burnett for years appeared to prop himself up as the clear victor, defender of all that was good in the criminal justice system. He allowed his history to shine and basked in it. Most people admired him, end quote. This judge would be going into battle with a 30-year-old inexperienced lawyer with 0 jury trial experience. A former prosecutor, Judge Burnett would split the trials, Damien and Jason being tried together, and Jessie separately due to his confession. and Burnett would preside over both trials, manipulating the outcomes. Paraphrasing now, but even overwhelmed and naive, Dan would manage to plant the seeds of justice that would sprout a decade later. The wait would be slow and painful, however, and Burnett would mistake winning a battle for winning the war. Well, a little bit of karma. We're going to fast forward to February 2017. A headline: ex-state senator agrees to ethics fine letter on, yes, now former judge and ex-state senator David Burnett. A complaint had been filed with the Arkansas Ethics Commission declaring that Burnett violated state campaign finance laws as a candidate for Senate District 22. He had accepted campaign contributions from 9 businesses not listed as permissible contributors. Losing re-election, Burnett accepted the fine and the associated letter because, quote, it wasn't worth following up anymore. It takes too much time and too much hassle, end quote. Well, karma. Not enough, but karma. Now, the heat of being in the national spotlight can make one sweat. Politics, business, and law tangling up each line of demarcation amidst the mass hysteria. Griping about all the publicity, Judge Burnett, nevertheless, let cameras into his courtroom. It was actually fortunate that he did, because cameras have no bias and would expose, quote, every unblinking strange bit of Jessie Misskelley's trial, end quote. The cameras were there from HBO's Joel Berliner and Bruce Sinofsky, who would produce 3 documentaries, the Paradise Lost trilogy, the first part premiering in 1996, Paradise Lost, The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills. Part 2 came out in 2000, Paradise Lost Revelations, and the final film, 2011's Paradise Lost Purgatory. I recommend watching them all. So both of the trials were filmed with cameras and mics on even during the recesses. During this, Dan would build a solid friendship with Berliner and Sinofsky, who came into this project expecting to do a story about teenage killers. But this shifted 180 degrees when they realized the defendants were innocent. Years after the trials, dozens of the DVD raw footage from these documentaries was sent to Dan. Sitting down to watch, he became physically ill watching himself being, quote, run over by a runaway train, end quote. It was just too painful to watch, but the raw footage provided great clarity on what actually happened versus the fallible, porous human memory that we all have. At a conference where Dan was speaking in 1997, he tried to rewatch Paradise Lost again, and he had to walk out. It was still too brutal, and he wasn't ready. The emotional pain still too sharp and penetrating. It was years later when he did manage to watch and experienced a weird form of déjà vu, seeing his younger self, quote, a babe in the woods, surrounded by wolves and loathsome characters who would soon be chewing me to bits. I was too innocent, idealistic, and hopeful to realize what was happening, end quote. The Satanic Panic tidal wave crashed over everyone in this case, impacting the police, judge, prosecution, as the hysteria engulfed the public. But when it became glaringly obvious that these teenagers were innocent, the judicial system facilitators dug in deeper, working to protect their own legacies, which is selfish and petty. These boys were simply expendable. Preparing for the trial, Dan would strive to get the world's best experts in false memory and police interrogation tactics to testify, who would decisively explain how Jessie Misskelley came to confess, generated by Inspector Gary Gitchell. He'd have alibi witnesses testify about Jessie's whereabouts, and this was a slam dunk. They'd be winning this thing. In the book, Dan writes that Burnett had, quote, some rather annoying habits and hang-ups that would make young lawyers cringe. His biggest and most vexing habit was that during the trial, a procedure that he was supposed to be acting as a neutral and detached magistrate, he would often fall back into his old role of prosecutor, sometimes cross-examining witnesses from the bench. End quote. Much foreshadowing here, murder bookies. Viewing the raw footage of parts that did not make it into the Paradise Lost films, Burnett displayed disparaging body language and facial expressions to the jury, and spoke disparagingly to both Dan and Greg. Conferring with Greg while he was writing, he told Dan, quote, "The deck was stacked against us from the beginning," end quote. The reality, the legal malfeasance, assumption, difficult judicial realities were harsh, with Dan playing the deck he was dealt. And the lives of Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley were forfeit from day one. January 1994, the trial was set to begin. Dan felt confident that justice would prevail, that the confession would be thrown out, contaminated fiction that it was, because Jessie was out wrestling when this happened and had witnesses that would prove it. He writes that this period was like sipping cognac next to a warm fire the night before the Titanic struck the iceberg. On May 5th, 1993, Jessie was working a roofing job, but didn't return after lunch because he had to go to wrestling practice. At home, a fight erupted between a kid and an adult in Jessie's trailer park. The Marion Police Department responded with Jessie Misskelley and a number of residents watching this unfolding. And the incident report puts this roughly at 6:35 p.m. Jessie was seen standing next to the police officer's car, talking to his neighbors. Thus, a police officer was one of Jessie's alibi witnesses. But what exasperated Dan is this officer didn't recall talking with Jessie. Well, amnesia or perjury? Was the cop rationalizing being on God's side by lying about seeing this devil worshiper? That same day, 8-year-old Cub Scouts Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers were seen riding bikes on the service road near the Blue Beacon truck wash and stop, approximately 6:30 p.m. Now, from Jessie's trailer to this location, they are several miles apart. About 7 p.m., Jessie and his friends were picked up by a brother of another friend, arriving at wrestling, which is in an old movie theater turned into a wrestling ring. People saw them there. Years later, after the Alford plea, the owner of this wrestling ring called Dan and told him, yes, in fact, Jessie had been at the ring the evening of May 5th, 1993. He felt bad because at the behest of the prosecutor, some guy named Davis, he had left town so he couldn't be subpoenaed by the defense for the trial. And he would not be the only witness ushered out of town to prevent their testimony. This would be a pattern of behavior by the prosecution that would be exposed. Crime scene. Well, murder bookies, we all know that a crime scene must be secured to prevent the loss of evidence or its contamination. This did not happen in West Memphis. The scene was trampled, the bodies were removed too quickly, and placed on the bank of the watery ditch to bake in the hot sun, which destroyed valuable evidence. The coroner took over 2 hours to arrive. The victim's clothing was found in water held in place by sticks near where the bodies were found, and there was no blood at the site. 2 weeks later, the police would conduct a luminol test, which only confirmed that the bodies had been placed along the bank of the ditch, where their blood had seeped into the ground. And coroners in Arkansas were elected and not hired based on education or qualifications. Hey, you get what you pay for. And usually the coroner was the town funeral director. So botched from the get-go, having an uncertified medical examiner only did further damage. Sent to Little Rock, the bodies were examined by Dr. Frank Peretti. He had failed the exam several times and just gave up on it. Peretti told Greg Crow and Dan that the time of death was impossible to determine because the coroner funeral director had done a terrible job of supplying the necessary information. And then, a few weeks later, Peretti experienced an epiphany and was able to specify the time. Meeting with the prosecutors to determine how the discovery process would unfold, the topic of the difficulties and controversies that would plague this trial came up. Both sides agreed that the presiding judge needed to be cautious and even-handed and impeccably fair, as well as able to withstand the pressure that was certain to happen with the media descending from every corner of the planet. Dan was concerned about politics, even being as naive as he was in 1993. Currying favor with the voters, who wanted a fast verdict, had to be avoided. But Dan was optimistic that personal interest and ill intentions would not dominate the trial. Oh, so I see why this man couldn't talk about this for 30 years. I really get it. The prosecution wanted Judge David Burnett, with all 6 defense attorneys strenuously objecting. Burnett's bias for the prosecution was legendary. If he felt the prosecution wasn't doing a bang-up job, he corrected this himself. Dan had seen this unfold in court himself. Hence, everyone came to think that Judge Olon Parker would be the perfect jurist to preside over the trial. A request was sent asking him to accept the case, but Judge Parker had to refuse. He had cancer, and the rigors required in these trials was going to be beyond him. Oh, and didn't they know that another judge had already claimed the right to preside? Quote, "That red-headed judge from Osceola, and you'll never get him to let go of it," end quote. Judge Parker chuckled. He was referring to Judge David Burnett. The defense was in trouble. Arraignments and turmoil. So the public learned Dan Stidham and Greg Crow were defending Misskelley, unleashing a tidal wave of phone calls from the media. And wow, some just did not realize that everyone has the constitutional right to an attorney to represent them. The lack of understanding of basic civics in the United States is startling and very upsetting to this former civics teacher. In the packed courtroom, 3 sets of parents were there, wanting blood. The rest just seethed with hatred. Given the heated emotions, the single unarmed bailiff, blissfully unaware, stood by the side wall and seemed inadequate. At the end of the arraignment hearing, Stevie Branch's biological father leapt at Damien Echols, screaming, quote, "Find justice in hell!" End quote. Well, thank God this was the worst of it, and it didn't spiral out of hand. Dan immediately complained to Judge Burnett. With such a high-profile case, had he not considered security? Oops. Well, from this point forth, Dan put his Smith & Wesson .355 into his briefcase. He'd be prepared, just in case. And giving this judge his due, Burnett had a virtual army of security for the next hearing and going forward. Just prior to the trial beginning, an article on Judge Burnett was published in the Memphis Commercial Appeal, with glowing praise of the judge, a former Eagle Scout, Vietnam veteran, and tough prosecutor. He told the journalist that he had, quote, read a book on Satanism for information purposes in preparing for the trial, end quote. My jaw dropped reading this. Dan's jaw dropped. The judge just broadcast for everyone that the prosecution's motive was Satanism. Well, Dan was living in the world of the shoulds. A judge should not say things like that to reporters. A judge should be impartial. The prosecution should present all their evidence during the discovery process. The police should investigate, leaving no stone unturned. The problem is the world of the shoulds is a fantasy land. Now, Dan believed that Jessie's confession was real and had been operating on this premise. I mean, no one would confess to such a horrible crime if they hadn't done it, right? But his thinking was wrong, and this would not be his first mistake. He just wanted to prevent Jessie from being given the death penalty. He writes, quote, Jessie's wobbly confession had begun to gnaw at him, end quote. Based on press accounts, Dan thought that Jessie had been an observer of the crime, unwittingly drawn into the crime scene by the other two, and his plan was to get Jessie to testify against Damien and Jason, which would net Jessie a prison term, but not capital punishment. But something was off. Jessie's cognitive limitations, the police and prosecutor being so contrary to his expectations, something was wrong. Driving home, Dan's mind went back to that letter little Jessie wrote to his dad. Jessie could barely read and write. So Dan realized he had to learn more about his client and put the puzzle together. Sitting with Big Jessie, he told Dan that Jessie's birth mom had abandoned him by age 4. He had struggled in school and his IQ was 68. His brother was profoundly mentally challenged. And his father was a hard-working man just trying to keep it all together, with the community turned on him, leaving him with no choice but to take it. He had refused any special ed classes, and a bullied Jessie had been pushed along in school, eventually dropping out. Jessie Jr. had barely had a chance in this life, but at least Dan could try to get him the best experts available, even with a very modest budget. But then, quote, by late September 1993, I knew Jessie Misskelley was innocent. It was an epiphany, so clarifying and dramatic, it would have impressed St. Paul himself on the road to Damascus. It was slow to arrive, but electrifying when it hit. End quote.
Whoa.
A few factors contributed to Dan's enlightenment. Crittenden County Deputy Prosecutor John Fogelman hadn't called to discuss a plea deal. Dan knew he needed Jessie to testify against Damien and Jason. So why wait? Well, when Fogelman did call, it was not what Dan expected. DNA on a T-shirt in Jessie's mobile home matched the blood of Michael Moore. Mind blown, heart sinking, there was the corroboration of Jessie's shaky confession. Now, remember, this is 1993 when DNA testing is in its infancy. So Dan shared this news with Jessie Sr., who broke down. It could not be. He had witnesses who were with Jessie. He just couldn't believe it. And then finally, Fogelman's plea deal arrived. The state would take the death penalty off the table, and Jessie would testify against the other two, getting life in prison with the possibility of parole. Well, Dan had to discuss this with Jessie, having no idea how to explain DNA to a guy with an adult IQ of 72. In jail, Jessie listened to Dan, making his normal yes or no response. If Dan pushed him for details, Jessie changed his answer, seemingly trying to guess what answer Dan wanted. If it was wrong, Jessie would try something else. As far as the plea went, Jessie was clear. He did not want to be in jail the rest of his life, and Dan promised to try to get a specific amount of time to serve instead. Oh, and Jessie, what about the bloody T-shirt they found? Well, now, Jessie was very specific and confident. Quote, every time I get mad at my daddy for something, I always go out and hurt myself, busting bottles and stuff. End quote. Well, holy mackerel, this was a real conversation they were having with Jessie volunteering information. He said that the blood on his T-shirt was his. Jessie showed Dan his knuckles with all these little scars, which confirmed what he had said. Again, Dan left beleaguered and confused. What was going on here? Paraphrasing now, September 27th, 1993. At another pretrial hearing, John Fogelman approached. Oops, he had been misinformed. And with the vigor of a codfish, he announced, quote, Oh, the blood on the t-shirt did not belong to Michael Moore after all. It was Jessie's. End quote. Click. The pieces fell into place, the revelation taking hold. No wonder Dan was frustrated with Jessie's inability to tell a story on how the murders happened. Jessie had no information on how the murders happened, other than what the police had told him, because Jessie Misskelley was innocent. He had not been with Damien Echols or Jason Baldwin. He was wrestling with friends. Eyes wide open, Dan earnestly believed that this would prove him innocent, and he wasn't going to have to accept a guilty plea for anything. And here comes that but. So Jessie Sr. had been talking to the press every night for claiming his son innocent. Well, he had also shared the names of his son's alibi witnesses, who were then approached by the police, terrified at being sucked into this god-awful case, and each one denied that they were with Jessie the night of May 5th, 1993. Well, who wants to be the alibi of a murdering Satan worshiper? I don't like it, but I can kind of see it. By the time these witnesses were willing to speak the truth, their stories had been compromised and the inconsistency damaged the defense. Eventually, Jessie would tell Dan that he was not there when the little boys were killed. He had thought Greg and Dan were cops, so he just tried to repeat what he had told the police already. He did not understand that defense attorneys work for him. Right after Christmas, Dan visited the crime scene, taking in its geography, abutting the truck wash and truck stop and that parking lot where the highways intersected. He realized he could have, quote, thrown a baseball at the service road and with a little luck might have bounced into the outside lane of the interstate. That's how close they were. Any killer may have parked there, walked over, had access to the boys playing and enjoying the woods. Dan believing that a local would have deposited the bodies in the Mississippi River, where they may never have been discovered. He has a point, but I don't think a lot of forethought and thinking went into this crime. It was a terrible happenstance, not a long-held fantasy. Next, Dan went to the West Memphis Evening Times office. He had discovered an article was printed 5 days after the murders, referring to the FBI assisting the local police and helping to develop a profile. In the article, Inspector Gary Gitchell was quoted saying that the profiles were based on the evidence and they were comparing this information to similar cases across the country. Well, now Dan went over to speak with Gitchell, asking for a copy of the FBI profile, and was surprised to hear that it didn't exist. This article was fake news. Well, fast forward. After Jessie's trial, Dan got a copy of the fax Gitchell had received from the FBI, which consisted of questions to be used when canvassing the area. Now, these questions provided a little insight into this non-existent profile. After the basic identification questions about family size and which vehicles did you have and were there visitors and all of that, the FBI had included, do they know anyone who is a Vietnam veteran? Did they know anyone from the area who wears a uniform? So this profile was of a crazy Vietnam veteran or authority figure in a uniform, which did not match Misskelley, Echols, or Baldwin. And this is certainly something that Gitchell would not have wanted Dan to know. Dan now introduces us to a pivotal person who helped tremendously in this case, Ron Lax, who helped to find a critically important defense witness. Lax, an opponent of the death penalty, introduced Dan to the work of Dr. Richard Offshee. Dan Lax also doggedly pursued the DNA trail, surreptitiously obtaining a DNA sample from stepfather of Stevie Branch, Terry Hobbs. And I will definitely talk about both of these men. Ron first approached Dan at a preliminary hearing when he still believed that the blood on Jessie's t-shirt was Michael Moore's. Invited out to lunch, Dan and Greg joined Ron, who told them about Dr. Richard Offshee, a sociology professor at the University of California, winner of a Pulitzer Prize, whose work was in false confession. Ron handed Dan and Greg a New Yorker magazine article on Afshi. After reading it, Lax had concluded that Jessie Misskelley's confession was bogus. Quote, "There are too many inconsistencies and things that he had just got dead wrong," end quote, which mirrored Dan's concerns. But Dan had some reservations. He didn't know Ron Lax from Adam, and he had no idea if he had his own agenda at work. Well, that was remedied when Lax told him that this was about truth and justice, not money, and he would work pro bono. The Afshi article discussed suspects who confessed just to get the police off their backs. Given Jessie's yes or no non-responses with zero narration, this rang true. Dan had a lot of research to do now on false confession and Dr. Afshi, and speak to Jessie's alibi witnesses, and get an expert to weigh in on Jessie's disabilities. And it was already the end of September. Ex-wife Kim's journal reveals what she observed when Dan got home. Quote, "She, the kids, and Dan at dinner. And then he helped her get the kids into bed. Everything seemed remarkably normal, except the look in his face. Dazed. He said, 'Kim, Jessie Misskelley is innocent. He did not do it. And I don't think any of them did it,' end quote. Which took Kim's breath away, shocked. With Dan slumped in a recliner, Kim said, quote, 'You better get some rest then,' end quote. Looking over the family photos from that fall into winter, Dan's expression is largely vacant. His thoughts turned inward, assessing and reassessing the case. Physically, he was there with the family, but the truth was he was absent, a young lawyer way over his head. The crime and confession did not match the physical evidence. It's a normal practice for law enforcement to take the confessed suspect to the crime scene, allowing him to lay out what happened where and in what order. Inspector Judicial did ask Jessie if he would accompany them to the crime scene, with Jessie agreeing. But the police violated their own practices and never took him here. Again, weird. They had interrogated a 17-year-old mentally disabled teenager without his parents present, even though Arkansas law required a parent to sign the Miranda waiver form. Hadn't they realized that Jessie was cognitively disabled? Especially when they had to ask him if he knew how to tell time and if he knew what a penis was. Yeah, I'm not loving this investigation at all. October 1993, Dan was going to reach out to Dr. Richard Afshi's office. With no funds to pay him, he was anxious about getting Afshi to work with him for free, debating with himself as the digital clock flipped to 3:30 a.m. He put his odds at 100 to 1. Afshi picked up the phone, and Dan launched into his introduction and sales pitch. Cordial, interested, Afshi asked for two things. FedEx him the transcript of Jessie's confession and the sparse police notes from it. And Dan needed to buy a book by Dr. Jessie Johnson, one that Afshi had contributed to, the first written on false confession. Now Dan told the doctor that he had no funds with which to pay him, and Afshi said, quote, "That's okay, we'll worry about it later," end quote. God, what a mensch. Good man. Acquiring the Good Johnson book, Dan inhaled it, and the mystifying case of false confession became easily understandable. This wasn't voodoo. This was solid scientific research. Following up with Dr. Afshi, he told Dan, quote, "That's the stupidest fucking confession I have ever read. I want in on this case and I will consult for you for free. And I'm coming to Arkansas to visit with Jessie Misskelley myself," end quote. I just about burst into tears reading this. December 15th, 1993 was when Dr. Afshi arrived at the Clay County Detention Center with Dan to do the interview with Jessie. The doctor returned to Dan saying with conviction that his client is innocent. off she advised getting an expert to review Jessie's polygraph charts, and the search for another expert began. Enter Warren Holmes, a world-class discerner of polygraphs. Holmes, a retired Miami homicide detective, he had administered polygraphs in the JFK and Martin Luther King Jr. assassinations. So this guy's good. Speaking on phone to the gruff Mr. Holmes, Dan put the odds at 15,000 to 1 that he would assist. But the man did listen to Dan's summary of the case and why he needed help, and Holmes agreed to take a look without committing to anything. 2 days after Dan sent the documentation, Holmes called back. His entire demeanor shifted to the positive. The West Memphis police polygrapher hadn't asked the proper control questions, and Jessie Misskelley had passed all of the questions on the murder, with no signs of deception. Holmes asked if the police had ever taken Jessie to the scene of the crime. Well, we know they did not. But Holmes said, quote, "If they had, even they would have known that he didn't know anything about these murders. Any good detective knows to do this, and I will consult on this case," end quote. When Dan told him he had no funds to pay him, he replied, quote, "I don't care, this kid is innocent," end quote. May the odds ever be in your favor. 2 for 2. Well, Dan's confidence grew and he was optimistic. And this is where I'm going to wrap up our first episode of A Harvest of Innocence. In 2 weeks, I will return with episode 103, Confession Suppression, with more hearings, rulings, malfeasance as faith is tested and justice strains under the pressure, with real consequences for Dan and his family and the West Memphis 3 and the parents. Thank you for listening. I see you as you hear me. Please take a few minutes to leave an awesome review that will help me make new murder bookies. Share your thoughts with me at jill@murdershelfbookclub.com, on X, Facebook, Instagram, and we are on YouTube now. You can join Patreon for $4 a month as well. Enjoy the crisp fall weather, pumpkin spice, and the gorgeous leaves changing. Written and produced by Jill, all rights reserved. Music, The Pewter Elephant by Blue Dot Sessions.